Welcome to Fair Food Futures, a discussion of civil society visions for food policy making that contributes to the 2022 People's Summit, Co-Building a New Eco-Social World, in the lead up to the UN High-Level Panel on SDGs being held in July this year. This contribution to the summit will act as the official launch of research findings from an Australian Research Council funded project, representing new and policy-relevant knowledge regarding civil society engagement with food system reform in Australia. The presentation to follow will also provide a forum for researchers, policymakers, and civic food representatives to discuss the policy mechanisms suitable for translating the research findings into action for fairer and more sustainable food systems, both in Australia and globally. I acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara traditional owners and their custodianship on the lands on which we meet today. And on behalf of the University of Queensland, I pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. My name is Dr. Kiah Smith, and I am pleased to present a summary of findings and to invite you to help us continue to identify the challenges and opportunities for making civil society's visions for fair food come to life. In 2019 to 2022, UQ researchers conducted a national Australian Research Council funded study to explore the ways in which Australian community food networks envisage and work towards more just and sustainable food systems. This research engaged close to 100 participants from community food networks, including but not limited to small-scale producers, alternative distributors, community gardeners, and food charity representatives, in interviews and participatory workshops with the aim of co-creating community-led visions of food justice in Australia. We asked, what does your fair food future look like and how do we get there? The research interest and design is based in one very simple realization about food system transformation. In order to build a better future, we must first imagine ourselves there. While Australia is not widely seen to have a food security problem, inequitable access to food is a significant domestic problem. Some 3.6 million Australians are food insecure. Up to 40% of edible food is wasted, and there has been a 10% rise in people seeking food relief in the past 12 months, with Indigenous people, migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, the aged, unemployed, young and rural people most vulnerable. COVID-19 and recent widespread flooding in Queensland have further highlighted challenges to food system resilience and equity. Panic buying, food charities unable to keep up with demand, and rising hunger amongst the most vulnerable groups was seen. In Australia and elsewhere, community food networks such as urban gardens, community-supported agriculture, farmers markets, organic cooperatives, food charities, food hubs, food swaps, and fair food organisations are important civil society stakeholders who actively confront these inequalities within food systems. We saw many positive examples of communities coming together to regain control over local food systems during COVID-19. This research has confirmed that community food networks tend to emphasise equitable access to food that is ecologically sustainable, healthy, and fairly produced, exchanged, and consumed, or widely understood as food justice. We also find that there are many ways to practice food justice in Australia and no single definition. These approaches are, however, differentiated from food security approaches focused on producing more food and provide an important framework for thinking about alternative food futures. They are examples of food utopias that we can learn from, and they are growing. Using future scenario building, the Fair Food Futures project aims to co-create future scenarios that have local participation and food justice at their core. It is part local initiative and part national research project, with a key goal being to enable a more inclusive discussion about what a just food system should look like. Using participatory methods, we have explored grassroots visions for the future of food, and then explored the diversity of paths to achieving these visions. The project had 4 aims. to examine the discourses, strategies, successes, and limitations of community food networks as they seek to address food justice, to explore how Australian community food networks at multiple levels envisage a more sustainable and just food future, and to examine how these visions connect to the global sustainable development goals. We also aim to identify the factors that shape, enable, or constrain the capacity for community food networks to inform food systems governance and to provide recommendations for policy reform. And finally, the project aims to interpret these findings in the context of emerging sociological theory. The research therefore also contributes new insights into localising the SDGs, especially number 2, zero hunger. So what is futures thinking or future scenario? Scenarios are narratives about the future that can help communities, governments, and other stakeholders better understand and prepare for upcoming changes, or identify present actions to work towards a desired future. They have been used widely by business and industry, but much less so by civil society movement actors who are interested in shaping food system change from the ground up. In order to gather the views of a range of civic food system stakeholders about their visions, scenario building requires 3 steps: forecasting, visioning, and identifying actions. In more concrete terms, the research started with identifying what fair food means to participants and what they saw to be the key drivers of change likely to affect the food system now and into the future. In doing this as part of forecasting, it allowed us to better understand key aspects of the past and present that got us to this point. What are the biggest uncertainties and what trends were out of scope for us to address in the project? Next, we identified a series of seeds, real-world drivers of change with the potential to shape the future of the food system. These seeds are examples of civic food system activism that already exist that might grow into the future. They are real-world examples of ideas and practices that are currently marginal but have the potential to become transformative. Third, we develop a set of scenarios for the food system based on these seeds, using different combinations of drivers of change as a way to capture a variety of possible futures. We ask, what is our preferred food future and how can we get there? The scenarios that emerge are then each accompanied by a storyline or a narrative, and we can use words or images to present them to broader publics. The final step in scenario methodology is to consider action. For this study, we've been particularly interested in understanding how the scenarios connect with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We do this by asking, what do we need to do? What needs to grow to reach this future? In summary, participatory future scenarios as a method acknowledges that different futures are possible and provides a process for exploring multiple scenarios for embracing or avoiding certain possibilities. The scenarios that result can help communities and policymakers to debate equitable pathways to achieve zero hunger and help to reform food system governance with stronger participation from civil society. The research engaged over 90 participants to give their input via participatory workshops and interviews. Participants represent a wide array of civic food networks and actors across Australia. Participants were located in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and Tasmania, and were mostly from urban areas. All participants gave their written consent or verbal consent to participate in the research. The resulting future visions or scenarios were then organised to tell new stories about the desirable food futures that fair food actors in Australia want to see. These narratives were organised around 4 questions. What is food? How is food produced and by whom? What does food consumption look like? And how is food justice achieved? The narratives were then refined by workshop participants to ensure that they accurately reflect the future visions being discussed. We also asked participants to consider if there were any elements that should be strengthened or reduced, and to consider whether food justice was indeed front and centre in each scenario. The research team then further refined the scenarios, ensuring that we have 4 distinct yet complementary scenarios for the future of fair food. All of this research has been synthesised and distilled into 4 future scenarios for reducing hunger in the Australian food system. The first scenario is the long table. And in this scenario, everyone is invited to share at a longer table, and we have achieved zero hunger. Food is at the centre of social movements' demands for rights-based policy approaches. The second scenario is called Fair Food in the City. This scenario reimagines cities as places for strengthening resilience, where food is grown and shared on the streets, in verge gardens, parks, backyard gardens, and community garden spaces. Food that is healthy and affordable, and often free, because food systems have been integrated with sustainability across the board. The third scenario is called Youth, Food and Climate Action. This scenario describes a future where young people are educated, empowered, and involved in determining the future of food. The final scenario is called Technology for the People. In this, food justice is achieved when technology is transformed into a common good and when equitable access to profits from technology can be reinvested to achieve zero hunger. For the remainder of the presentation, I'm going to talk you through each of the 4 scenarios, drawing on the storyline about what is food, how is it produced, how is it consumed, and what does food justice look like. The first scenario is called the long table. In this scenario, everyone is invited to share at a longer table. Food is healthy, local, and equitably priced, and is a key part of a more equitable social welfare system. Policymakers understand that hunger is closely connected to poverty and social exclusion, meaning that food is now a key mechanism through which to address a wide range of systemic inequalities associated with income, housing, health, education, geographic location, gender, and cultural background. Reducing hunger in this scenario goes hand in hand with reducing poverty, because cohesive food movements have successfully combined with other movements for justice, such as climate justice, gender rights, Indigenous rights, and labour rights. Food is valued for much more than just its nutritional content. It is also a cultural connector for families and communities, a key part of the social welfare system and a pathway to climate action. Community education and better prices for farmers means that most people can enjoy sustainable diets, where food is healthy, affordable, good for the environment, and culturally appropriate. Importantly, food charities have moved away from redistributing food waste towards approaches to healthy consumption that also ensure dignity and enjoyment. Charities have also joined up with other social movements to advocate around more systemic approaches to hunger and poverty alleviation. This scenario was created from considering the drivers for reducing hunger and food insecurity alongside an increased role for cohesive and organised food movements and activism. As a result, the scenario emphasises food at the centre of social movements' demands for rights-based policy approaches. A key element in the scenario, like all of the scenarios, is to localise supply chains. In this scenario, food production is located close to where people live, and market relations emphasise trust, proximity, care, and reciprocity. These short supply chains are economically viable, provide employment, and grow culturally appropriate food. Strong education campaigns have empowered food citizens. This is how food becomes to be widely understood as central to all people's experience of social and economic justice. Food deserts and food banks do not exist in this scenario. Instead, schools, hospitals, community centres and social housing grow healthy local food for those most in need. Therefore, everyone enjoys a sustainable diet. And food charities have moved away from emergency food provision and redistributing food waste to really play a key role in educating about food system change. The second scenario is fair food in the city. This scenario reimagines cities as places for strengthening resilience, where food is grown and shared on the streets, in verge gardens, parks, backyard gardens, and community garden spaces. Cultural diversity is reflected in the streetscapes of different suburbs, and much more food is free and available to all. People have much more autonomy to grow and gather this food from public spaces. This means that during a crisis, food consumption is not negatively affected because many people consume the food they either grow at home, in public spaces, or rely on community initiatives. To achieve this, town planning is committed to rethinking land access and repurposing urban spaces to grow more food. Regulatory barriers have been reduced or removed to facilitate this shift. This results in food that is healthy and affordable and often free because food systems have been integrated with wider land use policy, climate policy, and sustainability across the board. Expanding sustainable food production in cities is seen here as a means of reclaiming the commons and fighting back against the privatisation of urban space. Zoning, taxation, and regulation are used by governments as incentives to localise food production and consumption, and local councils take a lead role. In this scenario, food justice is pursued by citizens and community groups, as opposed to property developers, having a major say over the direction of urban planning. Conversely, government and business improve their social licence by engaging more closely with community food actors. When the fresh food is grown where people live, work, and play, this reduces carbon emissions and means fairer prices for farmers. To support this, we see a growth in cooperative distribution. Food hubs, community-supported agricultures, cooperatives, and land shares proliferate. Backyard and community gardens have also expanded to become major growers of food and places to store and swap seeds. This scenario was created to respond to two important drivers of food system change, that of widespread shifts towards more sustainable agricultural production, alongside pressures on land use for urban development. This resulted in a scenario that is mostly urban focused, but that also considers how cities connect with rural places. In this scenario, the regions are seen to be vital for the continued production of global food commodities, but they are reimagined in new relationships with local consumption. In particular, government and communities are working together to support more local procurement policies, which in turn grow local and regional businesses and makes fair food more accessible for cafes, restaurants, and other food service providers, both in urban and rural locations. The third scenario is called Youth, Food, and Climate Action. This scenario describes a future where young people are educated, empowered, and involved in determining the future of food. There is a strong ethic of care that underpins the activism of young people, for whom climate justice provides solutions for ensuring healthy soil, water, and air to protect our climate, revitalise farming communities, and mobilise the next generation of farmers. Concerns about the ageing farmer population, out-of-reach land prices, and the need to respond to the challenges of climate change have empowered young people to define new models of food production, consumption, and governance based on improved food and land affordability, alongside excellent food knowledge, education, and mentoring. Food production has been decoupled from fossil fuels, providing a pathway to climate action. In this scenario, young farmers are at the forefront of ecological food production, indicating a shift toward agroecology, closed-loop farming, short supply chains, and climate-resilient crops. This shift is driven by young people's ability to build collective power at the intersection of food justice and other issues, particularly climate movements. Inclusiveness, diversity, decolonisation, and well-being are also central shifts within this future. Food has a new ethic of care based in Indigenous sovereignty, environmental and social justice, grassroots participation, and self-determination. This ensures that food is part of the solution to climate change. A key element in this scenario is to address land affordability. Here, improved land affordability makes it possible for young farmers to enter the sector. Fairer prices ensure the long-term viability of farming, supporting young people at the start of their careers. All children grow up learning skills to grow and prepare healthy food and know where their food comes from. They also become ethical consumers who demand system change. With young people arguably the most unfairly affected by the challenges that climate change will bring, this scenario was created by thinking about a food future driven by young people's climate action. Here, young people play a powerful role in both food and climate activism. Young people are also involved in governing the food system. They're involved at the beginning of policymaking, which has become genuinely more inclusive and participatory. The second driver of change was an ethic of social justice, which was identified by workshop participants as representing young people's desire to see human rights, diversity, and equity within the food system. A key part of this in Australia is to decolonise the food system. In this scenario, decision-making involves Indigenous landowners, where farmland trusts recognise Indigenous land claims and Indigenous knowledges are respected and valued. This ethic therefore values equitable access to healthy, nutritious food alongside ecological care and care for each other. The final scenario is technology for the people. This scenario reimagines who owns food and agricultural technologies and businesses, who decides about food technology, and how the food system is regulated. Fairness is achieved when technology is transformed into a common good, democratically controlled, and contributes to fulfilling the rights of users, farmers, and eaters everywhere. Just as the ecological and nutritional impacts of new food technologies must be carefully weighed, questions such as who owns emerging agri-food technology, who benefits from its use, and who participates in decision-making are important parts of public debate. The definition of sustainable agriculture is expanded to embrace regenerative farming methods, to ensure equitable access to profits from technology, and to measure social outcomes such as zero hunger. Innovation in agricultural technology, particularly technologies designed to reduce waste and connect consumer networks, is developed with community input, and privacy and data sharing are strictly regulated. In a shift away from industrial agriculture, farming embraces healthy soils and composting and rejects pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, and GMOs. This grows healthier food and builds climate resilience. Control over seed and genetic resources, on-farm tools, microdata and big data, consumer networking apps, and the governance structures to support these have been redistributed through the concept of the digital commons. This is where technologies and their IP are openly shared, free to affordable and accessible to all. As a result, what was once a highly privatised sector is now mostly a public asset. In this scenario, bad food is no longer profitable. Instead, innovation puts waste back into the food system and corporate overproduction is substantially reduced. Overall, corporations are regulated more efficiently, and government's role is to support community-led projects. By rethinking the current economic model, this future emphasises degrowth. This refers to using fewer resources in line with planetary boundaries. Profit is no longer the most important measure of outcome. Instead, the future emphasises circular economies, cooperation, democratisation, transparency, and participation. Technology is created for and regulated by the people. In particular, farmers have the power to set their own standards, shifting power away from big retailers. First Nations people own and benefit directly from the bush food industry, for example. This scenario emerged from discussions about the negative impacts that corporate concentration in the food system has for food security, in which participants saw the increasing push for more democratic control of technologies as a key driver for change. Complementing this focus was the high uptake of sustainable agricultural methods, which many participants agreed are gaining traction as viable alternatives to business as usual, and was the second driver in this scenario. A key question for food system governance is how can community food networks influence the kinds of wider paradigm shift required that the 2030 agenda will need? In other countries, civil society participation in food system decisions has resulted in major transformations in people's ability to define healthy, sustainable, and just food systems and improve food access. In Australia, however, civil society is often excluded from food governance, despite evidence that it is instrumental in addressing hunger and social and ecological justice. According to the UN Research Institute for Social Development, what is needed is transformative localisation of the SDGs. They write that realising the vision of the 2030 agenda is more than just meeting its goals and targets. It ultimately requires changing the structures that generate inequality and poverty to ensure that no one is left behind. Transformative localisation of the SDGs, that is, meeting diverse needs and transforming economic, social, and political structures at the local level in an inclusive, democratic, and sustainable way, is crucial. In this project, the researchers found that our 4 futures are connected by 4 pathways to transformative action. These are intersectional solidarity and care. And this pathway represents commitment to redressing past injustices and connecting food with wider issues such as housing, income, healthcare, gender equality, and Indigenous sovereignty. Policies should aim to extend care to a wide array of food system actors and social groups, as well as to non-human food system actors such as animals and ecological systems. The second pathway is food and rights for all. This is based on legislating the right to food into national and state food policymaking and human rights instruments. This requires a major redistribution of power within the food system, as well as a redesign of governance processes to better facilitate concrete human rights outcomes. The third pathway is called food systems as a common good. This pathway supports a version of food justice that values land, air, water, soil, biodiversity, and seeds for their role in ensuring the health and well-being of all. Food systems must look beyond markets towards grassroots democracy where ordinary people can set the agenda, leading to significant changes in the way food is produced, distributed, and consumed. The final pathway is to start thinking about resilience beyond crisis. This pathway acknowledges that future crises under climate change are inevitable, and so food systems must provide a source of transformation. For food to be equally available during a disaster, as it is in normal times, requires a rapid shift to localising food production and consumption, redirecting financial profits to benefit local communities, and shifting governance processes to reflect long-term goals. Decisions about the food system affect all of our lives, but who makes these decisions and how? In constructing the 4 scenarios, we asked participants to consider questions of food systems governance. That is, the processes, rules, and structures that underlie decisions about how food is produced, distributed, and consumed. We are particularly interested to examine the role of civil society actors, members of community food organisations, unaffiliated with governments or corporations, who are often excluded from food system governance, both in Australia and globally. While questions of governance can seem abstract, they have real-world consequences for the functioning of the food system. Where community food groups have been able to participate meaningfully in food system governance, this has been shown to reduce hunger and food insecurity, increase food consciousness, and bridge the gap between civil society and government bureaucracy. We invite you to contribute to the next phase of Fair Food Futures by helping us to identify current challenges and opportunities in Australian food policy making for translating the research findings, the scenarios of the long table, fair food in the city, youth food and climate action, and technology for the people, translating these into action. Specifically, we ask you to consider, what are the barriers to policy action on fair and sustainable food systems in general? What are the barriers to greater participation in civil society? What are the enablers in this space, including potential mechanisms for greater participation and collaboration between civil society and other stakeholders in shaping fairer food systems? And finally, what are some concrete, immediate policy actions that could translate these Fair Food Future scenarios into action? Thank you for your time, expertise, and energy, and I look forward to seeing your questions as part of the People's Summit going forward.